You know, most people think monsters hide in the dark, so that they live deep in the woods or under the bed. But the truth is, the scariest ones wear a smile. They shake your hand. They wave to your kids. They laugh right alongside you while hiding something unspeakable just beneath the surface in the suburbs of Chicago. In the 1970s, there was a man who did exactly that. He was the life of the neighborhood. Always cheerful, always helpful. He threw block parties that brought the whole community together. He ran a successful small business, and when the holidays came around, he dressed up as a clown, red nose, white face paint, big shoes, and performed at children's hospitals, local events, and backyard birthday parties. The kids called him Pogo the Clown to parents. He was charming. To the public, he was generous. To everyone around him, he was the kind of neighbor you wanted to have. But no one knew what was buried beneath his house. Literally, his name was John Wayne Gacy, and by the time he was finally caught, police had uncovered 29 bodies stuffed beneath the floorboards of his quiet suburban home. He would eventually confess to murdering 33 teenage boys and young men. The world would come to know him by a different name, the Killer Clown. But back then, before the headlines, before the horror, he was just the guy next door, always smiling, always offering to help, always showing up to the party. And that was the mask he wore. John Wayne Gacy lived on Summerdale Avenue in a quiet part of Norwood Park, Illinois. His house was ordinary, one story, blue siding, a neatly trimmed lawn. It's the kind of place you'd drive by without a second glance. Inside, it was a different story. People later said the house smelled strange, like mildew or something rotting. Gacy always blamed it on plumbing issues, but the truth was much worse. Underneath the house, hidden behind a trapdoor, was a narrow crawl space filled with shallow graves. As police would eventually learn, it was where Gacy had dumped the bodies of dozens of boys who had vanished from nearby neighborhoods, bus stops, and street corners. Boys whose faces ended up on missing person posters that no one ever followed up on. And while they lay buried just beneath his floor, Gacy continued smiling. He continued clowning, continued shaking hands and posing for photos at parades and fundraisers. One neighbor even remembered him joking, "You know, clowns can get away with murder." At the time, it thought he was just being funny, but Gacy wasn't joking. What makes his story so disturbing, so unforgettable, is just how normal he seemed. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't act like one. He played the part of a good citizen so convincingly that even when rumors started to spread, most people just brushed them off, because it's easier to believe in a mask than to look at what's hiding underneath it. And that's exactly what Gacy counted on. He knew how to fool people. He'd been practicing for years, long before the clown makeup, long before the murders. He'd learned how to lie with a smile, how to hide the darkness inside him by being everything people wanted him to be: charming, helpful, funny, kind. But if you looked closer, just a little closer, the cracks were there, and eventually, truth would come pouring out. This story isn't just about a man who lived a double life. It's about how far someone would go to hide the worst parts of themselves, and how long a community will ignore the signs just to protect the illusion of safety. It's about how evil doesn't always come crashing through the window. Sometimes it parks its car in the driveway. Sometimes it brings balloons to your birthday party. Sometimes it shakes your hand with a grin and asks how your kids are doing. And sometimes it buries its secrets under the floor. This is the story of John Wayne Gacy, the man who made children laugh while dozens of families cried, not knowing their sons were never coming home. It started with a smell, not a strong one at first, just a hint, something you'd almost miss if you weren't paying attention. A sort of musty odor that drifted up from the floor vents in the middle of the night. Something sour, stale, damp, like wet soil or old rot. when police officers first walked into 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. It didn't feel like the home of a killer. The house was modest, lived in, a little cluttered. Wallpaper yellowed from time and cigarette smoke. Dishes in the sink. A folded clown suit in the bedroom closet. But underneath the surface, beneath the floors, something horrific had been waiting. For years, the case really broke open in December of 1978. And it started with someone who didn't fit the usual pattern. His name was Robert Pist. He was just 15 years old, a high school sophomore. He wasn't a runaway, and he didn't come from a broken home. He had a loving family, a future. That day, he'd planned to stop by a local pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois, where he worked part-time. Then, he was going to come home and celebrate his mom's birthday. They were supposed to eat cake, but Robert never came home. His mother waited, first for a few minutes, then 4 hours. She called friends. Nothing. She drove back to the pharmacy. His bike was still there. His coat was still there. But Robert was gone. That's when his mother made a call, one that would begin to unravel the life of John Wayne Gacy. When detectives first questioned people at the pharmacy, they were told that Robert had been talking to a contractor, someone who offered him a job, a man who said he paid more than minimum wage, a man named John Gacy. He was known around town. He wasn't a stranger. Police knew he'd volunteered with the local Democratic Party, even taken photos with the First Lady a few years earlier. He owned a small construction business called PDM Contractors, and he often hired teenage boys for odd jobs. But something about Gacy didn't sit right with the detectives. For one, he was evasive, kept changing details, claimed he never talked to Robert, then admitted he might have seen him that day. And then, as if trying to throw them off, he said something strange. He said, "You know, a lot of people go missing. Teenagers especially. They run away all the time." It wasn't a helpful comment. It wasn't empathetic. It was almost rehearsed, like a line he'd used before. The detective took note of that, and they started to watch him. That's when the smell came up again. Officers assigned to watch Gacy's house during a formal surveillance operation were rotated in shifts. They'd sit in parked cars, watching him come and go. Gacy, now aware he was under observation, began taunting. "Damn," he'd wave, invite them in for coffee. He even brought them sandwiches at one point, laughing like this was all some big misunderstanding. But the more time they spent around him, the more obvious it became. Something was off. He was erratic. Some days, he was calm and confident. Other days, he'd explode in anger or stay out all night. Once, he stormed into a lawyer's office and rambled for hours, confessing to dozens of murders, then left as if nothing had happened inside the house. Officers noted the smell again. By then, it wasn't subtle. They said it hit them like a wall the moment they stepped inside. A putrid stench that clung to their clothes and burned at the back of their throats. Some thought it was sewage. Others guessed dead animals under the floorboards. But Gacy, once again, had a simple explanation. It's plumbing issues. That excuse worked for years, until it didn't. It took 2 separate search warrants to uncover the truth. The first one, issued shortly after Robert Pist's disappearance, gave investigators the right to search the house for anything connected to the boy. They found several strange things: a class ring that didn't belong to Gacy, a driver's license for another missing teen, handcuffs, male clothing in multiple sizes, and a crawl space covered in fresh lime and dirt. But no Robert, and no obvious crime. Still, it was enough. While they waited on a second, brought a warrant, the surveillance continued, and Gacy began to unravel. December 21st, 1978. Police finally got the second warrant. This one allowed a full excavation of the crawl space. The moment the officers climbed under the house, smell became unbearable. They crawled on hands and knees through the darkness, flashlights cutting narrow beams through the dust. The ground was soft, too soft. The lime was fresh. Something was wrong. And then they saw it, a piece of bone, human, rising out of the dirt like a pale, silent scream. It was the first body, but it wouldn't be the last. Over the next few days, crime scene crews worked tirelessly to uncover the horror beneath Gacy's home. One by one, they pulled skeletal remains from shallow graves beneath the floor. Many of the victims were still in clothing. Some were wrapped in plastic or covered in layers of lime. Some had ropes still knotted around their necks. All of them had been stuffed into that narrow, hidden chamber, stacked and buried like trash. The final body count under the house would reach 29. 4 more were found in the nearby Des Plaines River, where Gacy had dumped them after running out of space. He later told police that the crawl space had started to overflow, that he couldn't keep track of the graves anymore. So he began tossing the boys in the river like they were nothing. When confronted with the evidence, Gacy confessed. Almost casually, he said the murders began in 1972. At first, he thought he'd only killed once. Then he did it again and again, until it became part of his life. He described his victims like objects. He remembered some of their names. Others, he didn't even bother to ask. He just knew how to lure them in. He offered money, a place to stay, a drink. Sometimes he wore the clown suit. Once inside, they never left. He'd do what he wanted and then bury them. He kept count for a while. He told police he killed 33 boys, but wasn't sure of the exact number. Some were buried so close together, their bones had fused in the soil. Some of the victims were never identified to this day. Their families still don't know what happened. It's easy to hear a story like this and imagine it's fiction. Someone could live in a suburban neighborhood for years with dozens of bodies under their house, and no one knew, but it happened. Neighbors had complained about the smell for years. Some kids even joked the house was haunted. A few people told stories about Gacy's strange behavior, the noises they heard, the weird things he said, the late night digging in the yard. But no one thought it could be real, because Gacy didn't look like a killer. He looked like a businessman, a neighbor, a clown. And that's what makes this story so horrifying. The scariest monsters, the ones who know how to smile. Before the bodies were discovered, before the crawl space, before the clown makeup and the blood-soaked headlines. John Wayne Gacy was just a boy. He was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, the second of 3 children in a working-class, polished Irish family. His mother was kind, quiet, and loyal. His father was a different story. People who knew John Stanley Gacy, the father, described him as cold, angry, and often drunk. He had served in World War I and returned with more than a few scars, some on the surface, most buried deep. He worked as a machinist in the stockyards and believed in strict discipline. He was the kind of man who didn't just rule his house. He dominated it, and young John Wayne, nicknamed Johnny as a child, could never seem to live up to his father's expectations. According to court records and later interviews, John Sr. would call his son weak. T used words like sissy. If Johnny cried, his father hit him harder. If he stayed quiet, his father accused him of being sneaky. There was no winning in that house, only surviving. Gacy later said he would hide under the porch just to avoid the beatings. But his father didn't just use fists. He knew how to hurt with words. He'd humiliate his son in front of others, call him soft, quest his masculinity, a poison that would take root and grow. Even as a child, Gacy seemed desperate for affection. Key, not attention, not popularity, affection. He wanted to be told he mattered. He wanted someone to say, "You're enough." But in that house, love was a currency no one gave freely. And so, he learned something very dangerous very early. If you couldn't be loved, Gacy discovered He had a skill, a mask he could wear. He could make people laugh. He could talk his way out of trouble. He could charm teachers, neighbors, even strangers on the street. People liked him when he was upbeat, cheerful, helpful. So he leaned into it. He learned how to perform goodness, how to turn himself into whatever people wanted to see. But inside, he was still aching, still angry, still hiding from the man upstairs, fists in hand. There's a story from when he was about 11 years old. He got hit in the head with a swing, hard, as a blood clot to form in his brain, one that would go unnoticed for years. After the injury, Gacy began having blackouts and random seizures. His moods grew unpredictable. He was sometimes dizzy, weak, or confused. By age 17, he collapsed while walking to school. Doctors discovered the clot and treated it with medication. But by then, something had already changed. Whether it was from trauma, brain injury, or just the weight of growing up in that house, a fracture had formed. And it would only spread. Teenage Gacy struggled to fit in. He wasn't athletic. He wasn't handsome. He was overweight and self-conscious. His classmates described him as awkward, sometimes overeager. He didn't go to parties or hang out much after school. He tried to get involved in student groups, volunteering, helping out, anything that earned him praise. But it was always surface level. Nobody really knew him, and that's how he liked it, see? Even then, Gacy was living a double life, and he hadn't even committed a crime yet. On the outside, he played the helpful, eager to please kid. But on the inside, he carried a storm, a deep resentment toward his father, toward the people who rejected him, and toward himself. He kept secrets. He collected grudges. He bottled things up. He built a fantasy world inside his mind, one where he had power, where no one could hurt him, where he wasn't weak anymore. At 18, Gacy dropped out of high school and left home. He drifted between jobs, fast food, sales, odd labor. He got involved in politics, volunteering for the local Democratic Party. He loved how it made him feel important, seen, part of something bigger. But beneath that charm, something darker was taking root. There were rumors, small ones at first, whispers from boys who worked with him, claiming Gacy acted weird. One said he offered him money for favors. Another said he woke up to find Gacy standing over his bed in the dark. No one took it seriously. After all, John was a good guy. He was active in the community. He helped out. He always smiled. Besides, people didn't want to think too hard about what didn't fit. They never do. In 1964, Gacy moved to Springfield, Illinois, and joined the local JC's, civic group of young professionals who organized charity events and business mixers. Gacy quickly rose through the ranks. People liked him. It was friendly, funny, dependable. K even won an award for Man of the Year. But this chapter of his life came with a twist. The JC's, while seemingly wholesome on the surface, had a much darker side. Behind closed doors, there were stories of drugs, strip shows, and wife-swapping parties. Gacy naturally fit right in. He used the group as a playground, another stage to perform on, another layer of the mask. Around this time, Gacy got married to a woman named Marilyn Myers. She was kind, came from a well-off family, and believed in him. They moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where Gacy managed 3 KFC restaurants owned by her father. He wore a white suit, kept his hair slicked back, and introduced himself as the Colonel. It was all very polished, very official. But that mask wouldn't last long, because now Gacy wasn't just acting strange. He was committing crimes. In 1968, Gacy was charged with sodomy of a teenage boy. The details were disturbing. He had lured the boy into his home, promised work, fed him alcohol, and assaulted him. Not once, but multiple times. The boy told police. Others came forward. Gacy tried to silence the witnesses, even offered money to someone to beat one of them, to staying quiet. it didn't work. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in the Anamosa State Penitentiary. His wife filed for divorce immediately and took their children. She never spoke to him again, but even in prison, Gacy kept performing. He became a model inmate, ran the prison kitchen, got a degree, hosted events. The warden once called him the best prisoner we've ever had. He served just 18 months, and in 1970, John Wayne Gacy walked out of prison, smiling. The mask was still on. He returned to Chicago and moved in with his mother. He tried to start over again, found work, started a contracting business, even bought a house in the Norwood Park neighborhood. It had a narrow crawl space under the floor. At first, he hired boys just to work, clean up, carry tools, paint. But that didn't last. His urges returned, and this time, it didn't stop. In 1972, just 2 years after his release, Gacy killed for the first time. He would later say it happened by accident, that he invited a young man over. Things got out of hand, and he panicked. But it wasn't panic, it was pleasure. And once he got a taste for it, the darkness that had been growing inside him for decades finally broke loose. This is how it begins, not with a monster in a mask, not with a clown suit, not with headlines and horror stories, but with a boy in a broken house, a child who learns to hide his pain by smiling, who buries his shame under jokes and praise, who discovers that power, real power, comes from silence, from secrets, and in time, from fear. That boy becomes a man, that man becomes a killer, and that killer becomes a clown. But long before the crawl space filled with bones, the real horror was already there inside him, waiting. When John Wayne Gacy walked out of prison in 1970, he did something most ex-convicts never manage. He rebuilt, he reinvented, he put on the mask again, and this time he wore it better than ever. To his neighbors in Norwood Park, Gacy was a success story. A man who had made mistakes, paid his dues, and come out stronger. He moved into a simple, one-story house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. The same house that would later become infamous. But back then, it was just another quiet home in a middle-class neighborhood. He painted the walls, kept the grass trimmed, smiled at neighbors, joined the local community groups. To most people, he seemed like the kind of man who cared, a kind of man who belonged. No one looked at the man behind the eyes, and no one knew that the moment Gacy moved in, the murders had already started. He was 28 when he killed his first known victim, Key Timothy Jack McCoy, in early 1972. According to Gacy's later confession, he met the boy at a Greyhound bus terminal. McCoy was just passing through, traveling from Michigan to Nebraska. Gacy offered him a place to stay the night. Friendly, helpful, harmless. They ate dinner, joked around, drank. The next morning, Gacy claimed he was startled awake and thought the boy was attacking him with a knife. He wasn't. McCoy had been making breakfast. The knife was from the kitchen, but Gacy stabbed him anyway once. Then again. When it was done, Gacy stood there, covered in blood, staring at the body on his bedroom floor. He later told police, "That's when I realized death was the ultimate thrill." That sentence would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives. After that night, something in Gacy changed. He was no longer just pretending to be two people. He was two people. There was the John Wayne Gacy that everyone in the neighborhood knew, the man who handed out campaign flyers for the local Democrats, who hosted BBQs, who wore overalls and clown makeup to perform at children's hospitals under the name Pogo the Clown. And then there was the other Gacy, the one who roamed city streets late at night in search of lonely boys, the one who offered work and beer and money, then trapped them in his home, the one who laughed as he locked the handcuffs, who bragged about his rope trick, who strangled his victims and buried them in the crawl space under his house, then slept just above them for years. These two lives coexisted in silence. One was bright, loud, cheerful. The other, cold, silent, buried in dirt. In public, Gacy was thriving. He ran a small but successful contracting business, PDM Contractors, short for painting, decorating, and maintenance. He hired mostly teenage boys, young men who needed cash. Some came from tough homes. Some were homeless altogether. To them, Gacy was a savior. He gave them work when no one else would, but there was always a price. One by one, the boys who worked for Gacy started to disappear. Some stopped showing up to job sites. Others vanished from bus stations, diners, and alleyways near his home. Police rarely connected the dots. These were troubled kids, they thought. Runaways, street kids, boys who lived on the edge of society. And because Gacy was polite, white, middle class, and a business owner, no one suspected him. He had weaponized charm. He could cry on cue. He could shake hands with politicians, bake cookies for neighbors, crack jokes at police officers. He'd been doing it his whole life, performing the role of a good man while the real Gacy stood in the shadows. And in the shadows was building his collection. By 1975, the crawl space beneath his home was full of corpses. The bodies were stacked, wrapped, buried, side by side, some lying on top of each other. Some were so tightly packed, the soil between them had compacted into a solid layer. The stench of rot would creep up through the vents in summer. Visitors noticed. Gacy always said it was a plumbing issue. No one questioned him. He controlled everything. When the boys came, how long they stayed, and when they died. He had developed rituals, the handcuff trick, the clown act. He even told victims that once they were in the cuffs, you're not going anywhere. He taught them, play music, talk to them as they begged, and when he was done, he dragged their bodies into the crawl space, through a trap door in the hallway, and then he'd go to sleep. Meanwhile, in the daylight, Gacy was being honored. He was shaking hands with the First Lady of the United States, Rosalind Carter. At a Chicago event in 1978, there's a photo of them together. He's wearing a suit and a smile and a Secret Service lapel pin that he was never authorized to have. No one knew what he was hiding then. The smile in that picture would later make national headlines, a symbol of the mask he wore so well. He also became a popular figure in local politics. He ran precinct captain duties, hosted parties, and offered his home for campaign meetings. Sometimes he'd even show up in the clown costume to raise money for charity. The costume helped him. It wasn't just makeup, it was protection, a shield, an identity he could slip into, exaggerated, harmless, silly. But there were cracks in the mask. At parties, some people said Gacy stayed in character a little too long, that he'd get too close to kids, say things that weren't quite jokes. Others said he drank too much, got touchy, rambled about tricks that weren't funny at all. There were warning signs, but no one wanted to see them because the truth was too horrible. Between 1972 and 1978, John Wayne Gacy murdered at least 33 boys and young men. He told police he buried 29 of them under the house. The rest, he said, he tossed in the Des Plaines River when he ran out of space. He said it calmly, casually, like someone talking about trash collection. Some of the victims were strangers he picked up in the city. Others were boys he knew, employees, neighbors, even friends of friends. One of them was John Butkovich, an 18-year-old who worked for Gacy and confronted him over unpaid wages. He vanished after their meeting. Gacy later admitted to killing him and burying him in the garage. The boy's father had gone to Gacy's house looking for answers. Gacy invited him in, smiled, said he hadn't seen John in weeks, and just beneath their feet, the body lay hidden. By 1977, Gacy's mental state was deteriorating. He drank more, slept less, became became paranoid. Neighbors heard him pacing at night, digging, moving furniture. Some said they saw him in the yard with bags. Others saw him hosing down the crawlspace entrance in the early morning hours. One neighbor told police that Gacy's house gave them nightmares long before anyone knew what was inside, and all the while, the city kept smiling back. That's the thing about monsters like Gacy. They don't always hide in the woods. Sometimes they live across the street. Sometimes they shake your hand at the store. Sometimes they make your kids laugh at a birthday party and then go home to bury another body beneath their house. And you never know until it's too late. To most people, clowns are harmless. They wear silly shoes, teach, they juggle, they paint wide smiles on their faces and twist balloons into animals. But they're supposed to be fun, safe, the very symbol of childhood joy. But for John Wayne Gacy, the clown, makeup wasn't just for show. It was a second skin, a mask that let him hide in plain sight. Not from the police, not yet, but from himself, from the thing inside him, the thing he couldn't or wouldn't admit he had become. The clown made it easier. The clown made it feel like he wasn't doing those things, that it was Pogo. He created Pogo the Clown sometime in the early 1970s. At first, it was just a gimmick, a way to stand out at local parties, community events, and hospitals. Gacy would show up in costume, red mouth, blue diamonds over his eyes, giant buttons, loud shoes. He did magic tricks, played games, danced. Kids loved it. Parents laughed. No one saw what was underneath. But what most people don't realize, what real clowns will tell you, is that Gacy's makeup was all wrong. Professional clowns are taught to round their features, to avoid sharp edges, cater to keep smiles soft and exaggerated in a non-threatening way. But Gacy's Pogo had sharp corners. The eyes and mouth were painted with hard, jagged lines, turning his face into something unnatural, something wrong, something that smiled without kindness and laughed without humor. He took Pogo seriously, too seriously. He practiced the voice, the walk, the laugh. He gave Pogo his own rules, his own voice, his own twisted sense of humor. When Gacy wore the costume, something changed in him. Neighbors who saw him in character said it was weird. The tie. He wasn't pretending to be a clown, like he became one, and not the fun kind. Sometimes he'd slip into the Pogo voice during regular conversations, even when he wasn't wearing the makeup. One friend recalled a moment at a party where Gacy, half drunk, started laughing like Pogo while talking about death. Another said Gacy once muttered, "Clowns can get away with murder," and smiled. They thought it was a joke. It wasn't. Gacy performed as Pogo at events all over Chicago, hospitals, parades, fundraisers, children's parties. He was well known in the clown circuit, even helped form a little troupe of amateur performers. They called themselves the Jolly Joker Clown Club. Most of them were harmless, hobbyists, people who loved bringing smiles to kids, but not Gacy. He used Pogo to build trust, to get closer to families, to get closer to boys. He would hand out business cards, offer contracting jobs, personal questions in a playful voice, offer rides home, all while dressed as a clown. The makeup became a shield, a way to cross boundaries that would normally feel strange. And behind that painted-on smile, Gacy was making mental notes. Who was vulnerable? Who wouldn't be missed? Who could he bring home? Some survivors would later say Gacy used the clown persona to disarm them, to make them feel safe, to make them laugh. Right before he changed, one boy, who barely escaped, described Gacy's voice dropping mid-sentence, going from cheerful to cold, dead serious. One moment, he was joking. The next, he was threatening. He'd say things like, "Pogo doesn't like bad boys. You're not going home. Pogo's got you now." He would pull out handcuffs like they were a prop, but they weren't. They were real, and once they were on, no one left the house alive. The clown routine was more than just a cover. It was a ritual. Some victims later described Gacy putting on makeup after they were already trapped, painting his face as they watched, sobbing and begging, unable to move. Others said he wore the full suit during assaults. He'd sing, giggle, dance. Some said he forced them to call him Pogo while he tortured them. One officer on the case would later say, that suit wasn't for kids. That suit was for him. Taste who he became when the worst came out. The clown wasn't an act. It was a costume for murder. As time passed, Gacy blurred the lines between his two identities. At one birthday party in 1977, a neighbor recalled Gacy slipping into a vulgar rant, still dressed as Pogo, in front of a group of teenagers. He started making sexually suggestive jokes, laughing hysterically. While the room went quiet, someone pulled him aside and asked if he was okay. Gacy grinned and said, Pogo likes to play rough. The party ended early. Nobody said anything afterward, because what do you say? Who suspects the clown? Police would later learn that Gacy had drawn sketches of Pogo doing unspeakable things. Some of them so graphic they couldn't be shown in court. In one, Pogo is holding a rope. In another, he's crouched in the crawl space, smiling above a grave. Years later, from prison, Gacy would continue to paint Pogo. Dozens of paintings, all with the same dead eyes, the same sharp mouth, the same cruel smile. He signed them with pride. They sold for thousands. Collectors, thrill seekers, and true crime obsessives bought them up, relics from the mind of a monster. Some people hung them in galleries. Others burned them because they couldn't stand the way the clown seemed to look at you, even without eyes. The irony is, Gacy thought Pogo made him beloved. He used to say, you know, kids love me. That love wasn't real. It was fear, cloaked in laughter. And the truth was, some kids didn't love him. Some cried when he got too close. Some felt it, that unease, that sense that something wasn't right about the man behind the makeup. But no one listened to the kids, because adults like Gacy don't get questioned. Not when they smile, not when they raise money for charities, not when they shake hands with politicians, not when they wear red noses. And so the mask stayed on until it cracked by late 1978. The cracks were visible. Gacy was drinking heavily. His stories stopped making sense. He'd show up to jobs late or not at all. Some neighbors said he stopped showering, stopped changing clothes, spent more and more time digging around his property. The clown suit stayed in the closet, but even without it, the Pogo persona was bleeding through. One witness described him sitting on his porch, talking to himself, then breaking into loud laughter alone for minutes at a time. Another recalled Gacy showing up to a child's party uninvited, dressed in costume, ranting about how Pogo's the only one who understands. The parents asked him to leave, but it was already too late by then. The crawl space held dozens, and Pogo was no longer a character. He was a warning, the thing that haunted investigators most, even after all the interviews, all the crime scene photos, all the nights spent digging under the house. Was how normal Gacy looked without the makeup. You'd pass him on the street and never know. You'd shake his hand and never feel it. He wasn't a monster in the way horror movies show them. He was worse. He was ordinary, and the makeup, the clown, was just how he showed you who he really was. Because monsters like Gacy don't live in the shadows. They live in daylight, and they smile the whole time. In a cold December twilight in 1978, a teenage boy named Robert Piest was supposed to come home with a birthday cake. He told his mother he'd be back in just a few minutes. He never walked through the door again. That moment, just another ordinary evening in Des Plaines, Illinois, would become the beginning of the end for John Wayne Gacy. because Robert wasn't like the others. He had people who noticed he was missing right away, and they wouldn't stop looking. Robert was just 15 years old, a quiet, hard-working sophomore at Maine West High School. Lanky, polite, bright, with a dry sense of humor and a quiet smile. He wasn't the kind of kid who skipped out. He had plans, dreams, a whole future ahead. That night, on December 11th, 1978, Robert was working a shift at Nissan Pharmacy, a local drugstore where he'd picked up a part-time job to save money for a new camera. His mother came by to pick him up, but Robert told her to wait a minute. He said a contractor had stopped by, offering him a potential job that paid better than the pharmacy. Just 10 minutes, told her. That was the last time she saw him. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Gacy had stopped by the pharmacy to discuss a remodeling job with the store owner. He bragged about the work his company, PDM Contractors, did around the city. While waiting, he noticed the teenage boy behind the counter. Gacy struck up a conversation, offered him an opportunity to make extra cash, said it was light work, just moving furniture, 15 or 20 bucks an hour. He'd done this before, dozens of times, but Robert was cautious. Cassie, he said he talked to his mom. Gacy smiled and waited that. When Robert didn't return to the car, his mother, Elizabeth Piest, waited and waited that 20 minutes passed. Then 30. She walked back inside the pharmacy. No Robert. Nobody had seen him since he walked out the back door. By 9 p.m., she was at the Des Plaines Police Department, reporting her son missing. Not a runaway, not a teen rebellion, a kid who had never gone off script, who had plans, who was excited about life, who had a loving family and no reason to vanish. Officer Ronald Robinson took the report, but it was Detective L.T. Joseph Kozenchak who listened, and he believed her. Des Plaines wasn't used to major crime. A missing teen usually meant a misunderstanding, a sleepover, a teenage spat. But something about this was different. Kozenchak started making calls that same night. He learned that the only stranger Robert had spoken to was the contractor, the man who'd been in the store that evening. That man was John Wayne Gacy. Kozenchak ran his name through the system and paused. Gacy had a record, a serious one. 10 years earlier, 1968, he'd been convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Iowa. He served only 18 months in prison before being paroled, and then he disappeared into Chicago's suburbs. Kozenchak raised an eyebrow. Why hadn't anyone in town heard about this? Why was this man still walking free? The next morning, Kozenchak sent officers to Gacy's Norwood Park home to ask about Robert. Gacy answered the door, friendly, confident, smiling, said he never offered any job to a teenager, said he didn't know anyone named Robert Pius. He claimed he had left the pharmacy by 8 p.m. and went straight home, but his timeline was foggy. When pressed, Gacy got cagey, then aggressive, then strangely helpful again. It was a pattern police would get used to. Charm, deflection, anger, denial, all in the same breath. Still, without hard evidence, they had nothing but Kozenchak's instincts were screaming, so he dug deeper. First, they checked Gacy's criminal record in detail. It was worse than they thought. The 1968 conviction involved luring a 15-year-old boy to his home under the promise of a job and then assaulting him. Gacy had pleaded guilty, admitted it, served time, but the system, broken and overburdened, had let him slip away quietly. The records were buried. The parole board didn't warn anyone. When Gacy moved to Illinois, he changed his address. He changed his story, but he didn't change by 1971. He was already repeating the pattern, offering boys money, work, drugs, shelter, and then silence. Kozenchak got a warrant to search Gacy's house, The first time, they only looked briefly. No crawl space, no digging, just a general walkthrough. But even that gave them chills. Inside, found some strange things. A driver's license that didn't belong to Gacy. Handcuffs casually stored in a drawer. A class ring inscribed with initials that didn't match his own. A photo receipt from the pharmacy where Robert worked, time-stamped to the exact night he disappeared. And then, a foul odor coming from the floor vents. The officers exchanged glances. It smelled like decay. Still, none of it was definitive. Not yet. But Gacy could feel the walls tightening, so he started playing a game. He tailed police officers, tried to intimidate them, showed up at their stakeouts with donuts and coffee, mocking them. At one point, he invited 2 investigators into his house for a casual chat. While they were surveilling him, he told them he was being framed, that the police were obsessed with him, all while just beneath their feet, the bodies remained in the crawl space, hidden by wood, dirt, and lies. The surveillance dragged on for days, then weeks. Gacy's behavior became erratic. He drank constantly. He ran red lights with police. Behind him, he fell asleep at the wheel. He'd show up at friends' homes, sobbing, talking about how he might be going away. One night, drunk and exhausted, Gacy walked into a law office and confessed not everything, but enough. He told his lawyers, "There are things you don't know. I've done things, horrible things." He told them where the bodies were, and that the number was in the dozens. Then he fell asleep. The lawyers were stunned. They called the authorities immediately, but before they could act, Gacy had vanished. That night, December 21st, Gacy drove aimlessly through Chicago. He visited old haunts, ate at restaurants, called friends, said strange goodbyes. Then he returned home. By now, police had secured a second, more thorough warrant, and this time it went underneath the house. It was a detective named Greg Bador who first crawled into the space beneath Gacy's home, a narrow, shallow dirt pit filled with old pipes and soaked earth. There, in the beam of his flashlight, he saw something pale. He reached forward and touched a human arm. He turned and vomited, because it was real, and there were more by Christmas Eve. The body count had risen to 6, then 10, then 17. Each time they dug, they found more. Some had ropes around their necks. Some had their faces wrapped in cloth. Some were buried on top of each other, so tightly packed that it was hard to tell where one ended and another began. The crawl space had become a mass grave. One forensic expert later said it wasn't just a burial. It was organized slaughter, like stacking firewood. But they were boys, some no older than 14. Over the next weeks, the police uncovered 29 bodies from beneath Gacy's home. 8 more were found in nearby rivers, dumped there after the crawl. Space ran out of room. That brought the total to 33 confirmed victims. Each one told a story. Each one had a family, and at the center of it all, smiling in photographs with mayors, shaking hands at fundraisers, performing at children's hospitals, was the man who killed them, John Wayne Gacy. And yet, he never once said sorry, never cried for the boys he murdered, never admitted it was wrong. He told reporters, "They're all just nobodies." And when asked why he did it, said, "I'm the judge, jury, and executioner." Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, Gacy held on to control, because for him, it was never about the bodies. It was about power. The boy who brought him down, Robert Piest, was finally identified among the remains in March of 1979. His mother, Elizabeth, stood silent as they confirmed it. Her son, stolen on his birthday, lured by lies, murdered within minutes of walking out that door. And yet, it was her voice that wouldn't be silenced, her questions that forced police to listen, and In the end, it was her son's ghost that cracked the clown's mask wide open. By the time 1976 rolled around, John Wayne Gacy wasn't just a man hiding secrets beneath his home. He had become something worse, a predator with a system. A man who knew exactly what kind of victims to choose, how to lure them in, and how to get away with it. In the way he talked about them, even years later, was colder than anything police had ever heard. He called them drifters, but they weren't. Most of them were just kids. In his police interviews after the arrest, Gacy liked to pretend he had a type. He said, "Didn't go out looking for no choir boys. These were hustlers, runaways, kids who wouldn't be missed." But the truth was way darker. Yes, some of his victims had troubled homes. Some had run away. Some had fallen through the cracks, but not all. Several were just teenagers, high school kids, with families, with friends, with lives they were building, and somehow they all ended up the same way, trapped under Gacy's floorboards. Let's talk about John Butkovich. He was just 17 when he disappeared in July of 1975. His story matters, not just because of how he died, but because of how close Gacy came to being caught years before the police ever thought to dig. John worked for Gacy at PDM Contractors. Kay was a good worker, polite, always on time, didn't cause problems. But toward the end of June, John started getting frustrated. Gacy owed him money, a couple of $100. It was summer, and John had plans. He wanted to go out with his girlfriend, maybe save for a car, so he asked for the money once. Then again, Gacy didn't like that. A few days later, John left his house to go confront Gacy one final time, and he never came back. His car was found nearby, keys still in the ignition, doors locked, but no sign of him. His parents were frantic. They called the police. They knew something was wrong, and they told detectives that the last person to see their son was his boss, John Gacy. The police did question him, and Gacy, always cool under pressure, said John had been upset, but he left without incident, claimed he probably ran away, said it wasn't his problem, and the cops, they believed him. After all, Gacy was a respected businessman, homeowner, active in politics. The idea that he could have harmed one of his own employees just didn't fit the picture. No warrant was issued. No search was done. And John Butkovich's body stayed exactly where Gacy had buried it, in the crawl space, under a thin layer of lime and dirt. Years later, when investigators exhumed the remains, they found his ID still in his back pocket. He never had a chance. And then there was Gregory Godzik. He was 17, too. Worked for Gacy, also doing construction. He disappeared on December 12, 1976. Just a few months before Gacy started dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River. Greg's parents were suspicious almost immediately. His car was found abandoned, with the battery missing. His wallet and coat were still inside. And he'd told his family earlier that week about some weird stuff going on at work. But once again, when they brought up Gacy to the police, nothing happened. He told investigators that Greg had quit and just vanished. Probably ran off to California, he said. He even called the family a few weeks later, just to check in and offer sympathy. But Greg had already been dead 4 days. When his body was finally recovered under the house, there was rope still, buried near his neck. Gacy had strangled him, the same method he used for nearly every victim, a variation of the same trick. See, Gacy didn't kill in a frenzy. He didn't lose control. His murders were planned, controlled, cold. He called it his rope trick. It started the same way each time. He'd lure them in with work, money, a ride, or sometimes with a promise of alcohol or weed. Some of the boys were desperate for cash. Others were just trying to get home. Once inside the house, Gacy played the cool, older guy. Funny, friendly, just a little weird. He'd show them magic tricks, doke around, maybe offer them handcuffs to try on. not to show how he used them in his clown act. That's when he'd strike. Once the handcuffs were on, there was no way out. Gacy would grab a rope, twist it with a piece of wood, a kind of tourniquet, and tighten it until the boy stopped breathing. Sometimes it took minutes, sometimes longer, and when it was over, he'd go eat dinner, watch TV, like nothing happened. He told police once, after the first few, it got easy. His murders weren't spaced far apart either. In 1976 and 1977, Gacy killed so often that his crawl space literally started to fill. He told detectives later that he was worried about the smell, about the dirt collapsing, about losing track of where the bodies were. Let that sink in. He had so many bodies under his house that he couldn't remember where they all were. And even then, with all that death right under his floor, Gacy kept inviting guests over, hosting parties, even sleeping just feet above the decomposing remains. One of his neighbors later said, it was like he was living on top of a graveyard. But no one could prove anything. Not yet. One of the most haunting cases from that time was John Chick. He was 19, and unlike some of the others, he actually knew Gacy outside of work. They were acquaintances. Gacy even let John borrow his car once. When John went missing, his family was devastated. But the case hit a weird turn when someone started calling them from John's phone. The person on the other end said John was fine, that he'd just left town for a bit, that he'd be back. But it wasn't John, it was Gacy. He was using the boy's car, calling from the boy's phone, pretending to be him after he'd already killed him, and no one suspected a thing. Gacy's arrogance was growing. He stopped caring if anyone noticed. At one point, a teenage boy named Jeff Rickno actually escaped after a horrifying encounter. Gacy had lured Jeff into his car, knocked him out with chloroform, and took him back to the house. Over the next day, he assaulted him repeatedly, drugging him, tying him up, leaving him in a corner for hours before returning again. Jeff managed to survive, barely, and when he went to the police, they didn't take him seriously. No warrant, no arrest, nothing. Jeff was left to recover on his own, terrified, traumatized, and furious. He eventually tracked down Gacy's license plate himself and gave it to detectives. But even then, the investigation stalled, because how could a respected local contractor also be a monster? It's the question that kept coming up, and no one had the answer until it was too late. Now, let's stop for a second and think about this. What made Gacy different from other serial killers wasn't just the number of victims, wasn't the crawl space, or even the clown costume. It was how long he got away with it. He killed for nearly 7 years. He was interviewed multiple times. It was reported by victims, families, neighbors, but his clean-cut image, the smiling, funny, politically connected businessman, it gave him armor. People wanted to believe the best, and Gacy knew it. He played into it. He said, once people trust you when you make them laugh. As the body count climbed, Gacy started running out of space, literally. The crawl space had no more room. He told police it had started heaving up, like the bodies were pushing against the floor. That's when he changed tactics. He began dumping victims in the Des Plaines River. He'd take them out late at night, wrapped in sheets or plastic, and drive toward the city. Then toss them into the water like garbage. The currents would carry them away, sometimes miles downstream. And again, he figured no one would care. They were just drifters. But they weren't. They were sons, brothers, friends, people, and one by one, their names would finally be uncovered. But not until Gacy slipped up, for real this time, and that's where we'll go next. It all came down to one kid, one disappearance, one mistake, the last one Gacy would ever make. His name was Robert Pist. He was 15, a high school sophomore, kid who still lived at home, had a paper route, and wanted to buy a used camera to start a photo business. He wasn't a runaway. He wasn't a drifter. He was just kid. and he was the one that finally cracked the case. It was December 11th, 1978. A cold, gray Monday in the small suburb of Des Plaines, Illinois. Robert was working his part-time shift at Nissan Pharmacy, a local mom-and-pop drugstore near home. His mom had stopped by to pick him up after work. They were planning to go out for his birthday that night, but Robert never came out, and he never came home. His last words to his mother were, "I'll be out in a minute. I just need to talk to a contractor about a job." That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. That night, the Pius family reported him missing immediately. His mom was adamant. Rob wasn't the type to disappear, had no reason to run. He's been excited about dinner, about Christmas. But when Des Plaines police started investigating, they got the same answer Gacy always gave. "I never saw the kid," he said. He claimed he didn't even go into the pharmacy that day. But this time, something felt different. The lead investigator assigned to the case was Detective Joe Kozenchak. He wasn't a rookie. He'd worked enough missing persons cases to spot red flags, and this one lit up like a Christmas tree. First, Rob had no history of trouble. No drugs, no problems at home. Second, the timeline didn't add up. And third, that contractor. He had a record, because Kozenchak did what few others had bothered to do before. He ran Gacy's background. And what came up? A conviction in 1968. Sodomy of a minor. 10 years in prison, served less than 2. It was the kind of thing Gacy had, buried under layers of political glad-handing, business charm, and local charity work. But now, it was out, and it didn't look good. Kozenchak decided right then, Gacy was their guy. At first, they couldn't do much. No body, no crime, not yet. But they could start watching him. They got a judge to sign off on surveillance and assigned 2 officers to tail him minus 24/7s. And when they did, Gacy cracked. The cops following Gacy were low-key, just a couple of regular guys driving a beat-up, unmarked car. But Gacy noticed them fast. He'd pull up next to them at gas stations, offer them coffee, buy them breakfast, joke around like it was a game. He said, "You boys want to come in for breakfast?" They declined. He said, "Hell, I'll buy you dinner. Want a drink?" They said no. He even invited them inside, offered them a tour of his house, and here's where it gets chilling. They went in, not knowing what was under the floorboards, not knowing what had happened in that very living room. And they said it smelled strange. There was an odor in the house. Foul, sweet, thick, like something rotting. But Gacy blamed it on a broken sump pump, said the crawl space had flooded. Old garbage. Okay, rats. Maybe it was just believable enough to get by. But one of the officers, a younger guy, couldn't stop thinking about it. He said later that when he closed his eyes, he could still smell it. Something primal, something dead. Still, they had no warrant yet. Meanwhile, Gacy was spiraling. The pressure of being followed, of his name popping up in police reports, of detectives talking to neighbors and old employees. It was all too much. He started drinking heavily, staying out all night, sleeping in his car. He told his friends he was being harassed, told others the cops were just jealous. He even confessed to one old acquaintance, "They're gonna get me for something I didn't do." Go. He was unraveling, and the cops, they were watching every move. Then they got lucky. One of the surveillance officers followed Gacy to a gas station where he handed a small package to a man, one of his former employees. The cops detained the guy and found marijuana and pills. Inside, he said Gacy gave it to him, just helping out. But it was enough. The police now had probable cause to search Gacy's home. The warrant came through on December 13th, 1978, and what they found changed everything. The initial search wasn't the dramatic crawlspace scene you might imagine. It's not yet. They walked through the house, room by room. Gacy was cordial, nervous, sweating, but polite. They looked through the bedroom, the office, the garage, and in a hallway closet. They found something. A receipt. Folded, crumpled, partially torn, but the name on it stopped them cold. It was for a roll of film, and the name on it was Robert Piest. It was proof he had been in the house. Proof Gacy had lied. The detectives left that day without digging, but now they were building a serious case. Subpoenaed records, brought in canine units, talked to more former employees, and every piece led back to one place, the crawl space. Gacy, meanwhile, began to fall apart. On December 20th, he walked into his lawyer's office. He looked wrecked, unshaven, eyes bloodshot. He reeked of alcohol. And he said 5 words that made their blood run cold. "I've killed 30 people or more." They didn't believe him, not at first. Tay thought he was exaggerating, bragging, talking nonsense under stress. But Gacy kept going. He told them about the crawl space, about the river, about the rope, about the handcuffs, about the drifters. And then he said something no one was ready for. "I used to sleep above them." Police got a second warrant that same day. One allowed digging. They entered the crawl space, a dark, claustrophobic space, barely 3 feet high, damp and cold, with the smell of mold earth. Something else. They started removing dirt. Not far in, they found a human arm bone, and then a skull, and then the bodies just kept coming. Over the next several weeks, the remains of 29 boys and young men were recovered from beneath 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, each buried in layers, some wrapped in plastic, some tied with rope, some stacked like lumber. The youngest was just 14, and as the bodies came out, the silence was replaced by headlines. "Clown Killer's Crawl Space Yields Horror Pogo." The clown was a serial killer. 29 bodies found in suburban nightmare house, the entire country watched as police turned up body after body. And still Gacy talked. He described the murders like he was ordering dinner. He laughed sometimes, shrugged, smiled. He gave names when he remembered them, faces, dates, but often he didn't. He'd say, "I think that one was a hitchhiker, maybe from 75, or he fought me a little, but the rope worked quick." He showed no remorse, no shame, just logistics. 3 more bodies were pulled from the day planes, river, the ones Gacy dumped when his house got too full. That brought the confirmed death toll to 33. Though, even today, some believe it could be higher. He was charged with 33 counts of murder, and for the first time in over a decade, John Wayne Gacy wasn't smiling. March 1980, Chicago. The snow was melting, but the frost in the public's bones hadn't. The streets outside the Cook County Criminal Courts building were packed. Reporters, curious onlookers, protesters holding hand-painted signs that read things like, "Death to the killer clown. Where's my son, Gacy? Never again. Never again." And in the middle of all that noise, John Wayne Gacy, grinning. Not because he was insane. Not because he didn't understand what was happening, no. He grinned because he thought he was untouchable. Gacy walked into that courtroom like he was stepping onto a stage, wearing a suit, hair slicked, eyes scanning every face in the gallery, smirking like he was still mayor of his own imaginary kingdom. He faced 33 counts of murder, the most in Illinois history at the time. The prosecution was seeking the death penalty. The nation was watching, and Gacy, he pled not guilty. The trial opened on February 6, 1980. A jury of 7 men and 5 women were selected. And they weren't just there to decide guilt. That was already written in blood. They were there to decide something else. Was Gacy insane? Because that's the defense he chose. After years of meticulous planning, predation, and deception, he claimed he had no control. His lawyer said he had multiple personality disorder. That there were 4 Jacks inside of him. John the contractor, who ran his business. John the politician who charmed the town, Kay Hanley who committed the murders, and Pogo the clown who didn't know anything at all. They claimed he was mentally ill, unfit to be executed, a man so far removed from himself that he couldn't be held entirely responsible. But the prosecutors, they were ready. Robert Egan and Terry Sullivan, lead prosecutors, stood before the jury and laid it all bare. They showed photos of the crawl space. They listed names. They described how Gacy used the handcuff trick, luring victims in by pretending to be a magician, then locking them up before revealing they couldn't get out. And then came the confession tapes. You see, Gacy had talked. He had confessed to his lawyers, and while most of that was protected under attorney-client privilege, he also made dozens of statements to police during and after his arrest. He described the victims as things. He told them how some of them begged. He even laughed about how hard it was to dig in the crawl space, saying it got too crowded. That's when I had to start using the river. The jury heard all of it, and then they heard from the survivors. One of the most harrowing testimonies came from Jeffrey Rignall, a young man who had been lured by Gacy, chloroformed, assaulted, and left for dead in Lincoln Park. He took the stand, shaking, pale, years later, and the trauma still radiated off of him like heat. He said, "He drove nails into my head." He said, "I woke up with blood on my chest and I couldn't move." He said, "I thought I was going to die." But he didn't, and his voice shook the courtroom. But it wasn't just what the jury heard, it was what they saw. Gacy, during testimony, would draw sketches of himself as Pogo the clown. He passed them to his lawyers. Sometimes he chuckled at his own doodles. Other times he closed his eyes and dozed off, literally falling asleep while pictures of his victims' remains were shown to the court. He seemed unbothered, not insane, just unrepentant. At one point, during a break in proceedings, a news camera caught him whispering to a guard, smiling, "They'll never fry me, bet on it." But he was wrong. After 5 weeks, the prosecution rested. The defense brought in psychiatrists, former friends, character witnesses. They tried to argue that Gacy had suffered head injuries, God, that he'd grown up with an abusive father, that he'd repressed his homosexuality and lashed out, but none of it stuck. The truth was too loud. The crawl space, too dark. The final day of the trial arrived on March 12, 1980. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours. They returned with a verdict: guilty on all 33 counts. And when the judge read the sentence, death, Gacy blinked, SMIRKED, and then said nothing. But that wasn't the end of the circus, because Gacy, true to form, wouldn't shut up. Over the next 14 years, he became a fixture of death row, writing endless letters, granting interviews, and even selling oil paintings of himself as Pogo the Clown. You could buy one for $200. Some people did. Others burned them. He gave interviews to CNN, 2 local radio stations, to anyone who would listen. In one of his most infamous quotes, he said, "I should never have been convicted of anything more serious than running a cemetery without a license." That's what he thought of 33 murdered boys. And still, the appeals came. For years. Dozens of them, each more desperate than the last. He claimed the police planted evidence that the crawl-space bodies weren't his, that the boys were prostitutes, and that he was being persecuted. He tried to file post-conviction relief motions, petitions for clemency, even claimed his execution would be a violation of human rights. None of it worked. Eventually, after nearly a decade and a half of courtroom theater, emotional manipulation, and grotesque self-promotion, the date was set, May 10, 1994. Gacy would be executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center. He was 52 years old. The day of the execution, protesters gathered again. Some held signs saying justice for the 33. Others just wanted to see a monster die. Outside the prison, people held barbecues. They handed out t-shirts. There was even a sign that read, "No tears for the clown, Gacy's final meal." Fried chicken, fried shrimp, French fries, strawberries, a Diet Coke. He ate it all. He painted one last pogo sketch that day. And then, at 12:58 a.m., he was strapped to a gurney. His last words, "Kiss my ass." The chemicals flowed, smirk faded, and at 1:14 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was declared dead. But here's the thing, the pain he caused didn't die with him. The questions didn't stop. Not all the victims were identified. Not all the families had closure. In the house at 8213 West Summerdale, it was demolished, flattened to dirt. Nothing stands there today except the weight of memory. To understand the horror, we have to look beyond the bodies, beyond the crawl space, and behind the painted smile. We have to enter the mind of John Wayne Gacy. What made this man tick? How could someone so charming, so involved in the community, hide such darkness? And was there a point where it all began? Early life? The Roots of Darkness. Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. His childhood wasn't easy. His father, John Sr., was a strict and often violent man. He drank heavily and was emotionally abusive. Young John learned early on to hide, to suppress. He felt powerless. His mother, though loving, was often overshadowed by the chaos. Some psychologists believe this toxic environment has planted the seeds of his future, social struggles, and hidden desires. As a boy, Gacy struggled socially. He was shy, awkward, and bullied in school, called names, and felt isolated. But beneath that shy exterior was a secret he desperately tried to hide. John Wayne Gacy was a closeted gay man in a time and place where that was dangerous. He feared rejection, violence, and the loss of control. The mask of normalcy. After high school, Gacy moved around, working odd jobs. He married young twice and had 2 children. On the surface, he seemed to be building a normal life. He became involved in local politics, community organizations, and charities. He volunteered, ran for office, and even hosted events to the outside world. He was a model citizen, but behind closed doors, the mask slipped. The duality of John and Pogo. Gacy was infamous for performing as Pogo the Clown, entertaining children at parties, hospitals, charity events. He painted on a smile, put on a costume, and became a different person. Some psychologists suggest this wasn't just a job. It was a way for Gacy to control how others saw him, a way to hide, to pretend. But beneath the clown's painted grin was a man filled with rage, confusion, the craving for power. The need for control. Control was everything to Gacy. He felt powerless as a child. He feared exposure. He craved dominance. His crimes were methodical, cold, and precise. The handcuffs, the chloroform, the rope, all tools to enforce his will. The psychopathy factor. Experts who studied Gacy's case describe him as a psychopath. That means he had a lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulativeness, no remorse or guilt. Gacy knew his actions were wrong. He just didn't care. He viewed his victims as objects, pawns in his twisted game. Dissociation and denial. Gacy often claimed he wasn't responsible for some murders. He spoke of multiple personalities, like the Jack Hanley he invented. Some experts believe this was a defense mechanism, a way for Gacy to separate himself from his crimes. But it was a lie. There was no evidence he had dissociative identity disorder. Instead, he was fully aware, fully in control. The escalation, the killings, didn't happen overnight. They started small, isolated incidents, but over time, they escalated in frequency and brutality. He became bolder, more careless, more arrogant. It's a classic, pattern among serial killers: manipulation and deception. Gacy was a master manipulator. He used charm and kindness to lure victims. He offered jobs, rides, money. He befriended police officers. He hosted parties. And when suspicion arose, he lied repeatedly. He convinced friends and family he was innocent. Even as bodies piled beneath his house, the dark void inside some say Gacy was driven by an inner emptiness, a void he tried to fill with control and violence. His victims weren't just targets. They were a way to assert power over the helpless, a way to escape his own feelings of insignificance. Lessons from the mind of a monster understanding. Gacy's psychology doesn't excuse his actions, but it helps us recognize warning signs, and it reminds us how dangerous hidden darkness can be. John Wayne Gacy was, for years, the perfect neighbor. A man who smiled wide, shook hands firmly, and knew everyone's name. But behind this facade was a chilling truth. He was a monster hiding in plain sight. How could a man who killed 33 young men live openly in a neighborhood, host parties, and attend community events without anyone suspecting a thing? That question haunted the police, the families, and the community long after the arrest. The neighborhood hero to many in the Des Plaines area, Gacy was a community pillar. He was active in the local Democratic Party, even managing the party's summer picnics. The Jaycees, a civic organization that focused on leadership and volunteer work. Charitable organizations, especially those focused on children's hospitals and events. He volunteered as Pogo the Clown at birthday parties, parades, and fundraising events. Parents trusted him with their children. Friends invited him to their homes. The mask he wore, this public persona, was meticulously crafted. Gacy understood the power of appearances. He was always polite, well-dressed, and charming. He laughed easily, and he made people feel comfortable. His neighbors described him as the last person you'd suspect. A phrase repeated over and over in interviews and articles. The house on Summerdale, 8213 West. Summerdale Avenue was Gacy's fortress. The house itself was unremarkable, a modest suburban home with a neatly kept lawn. Inside, he entertained guests often. Neighbors recalled parties with loud music, laughter, and even clowns. Yet, beneath the floorboards was a secret too horrifying to imagine. The community's blind spot. Why did no one see the warning signs? In hindsight, some neighbors mentioned oddities, strange smells wafting from the house, late-night visitors who didn't stay long, loud noises or sounds of digging. But these were dismissed as quirks or everyday suburban life. Some thought Gacy might have been burying a dog or working on a basement project. Others simply wanted to believe the best friends and family. The denial in Gacy's own family struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the killer revealed. His mother maintained that he was innocent. His second wife was shocked and devastated. Friends recalled his mood swings, but never imagined the depths of his crimes. Some said he confided in them about dark urges, but those moments were brushed off as jokes or exaggerations. Denial ran deep. The police and missed opportunities. Law enforcement had several chances to catch Gacy early. There were reports of missing boys linked to him, testimonies from survivors like Jeffrey Rignall, suspicious behavior observed by officers during surveillance, but each time, police hesitated. His clean record, political connections, and community standing shielded him. He was interviewed multiple times, but walked free. The perfect crime. Gacy's methodical approach helped him evade suspicion. He carefully selected victims, mostly vulnerable young men, often runaways or troubled teens. He controlled the crime scenes, buried bodies quickly, and kept his personal life separate from his dark side. He knew how to talk to police, how to hide evidence. He was smart and cold. The power of charm and deception. Gacy's charm was a weapon. He gained trust quickly, offered jobs, rides, friendship to vulnerable boys. He'd even give gifts, small tokens, to keep victims close. He was a master of manipulation. The community shattered when the truth finally came out. It was like a bomb. Neighbors felt betrayed, horrified. How had they missed it? Parents feared for their children. The media swarmed the quiet suburb. Gacy became a symbol of how evil can hide behind a smile. Lessons learned. Gacy's case exposed flaws in police work and community awareness. It showed the danger of blind trust, and it reminded us to listen when something feels off, to ask questions, to protect the vulnerable. The moment the community had feared, yet secretly hoped for, finally arrived. John Wayne Gacy's reign of terror was coming to an end. But it wasn't sudden. It wasn't a lucky break. It was the result of months of dogged police work, patient surveillance, and a community's desperate search for answers. December 11th, 1978. The missing boy who changed everything. The disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Keyes was the spark that ignited the final investigation. Rob wasn't just another missing kid. His disappearance was different. He was last seen leaving work, intending to meet a contractor, the very same man who would become the prime suspect. Police began to focus on Gacy's detective Joe Kozenchak, assigned to the case. Immediately found inconsistencies in Gacy's story. Gacy claimed he had never met Robert, but a receipt for a roll of film found in Gacy's home and made out to Robert Piest contradicted that. The receipt was the first real evidence linking Gacy to the missing boy. Surveillance begins with a judge's permission. Police began surveillance of Gacy's house and movements. They assigned plainclothes officers to follow him 24/7 at first. Gacy appeared to act normally, but the officers noticed strange behaviors, visits to secluded spots, frequent trips to the house late at night, meetings with young men who soon disappeared. The suspicious older neighbors had long complained about a foul smell coming from the house. Police officers entering the home noticed it immediately. Gacy claimed it was due to a broken spout pump and flooding in the crawl space. But the odor was stronger than any plumbing issue. It was the smell of death. Key break. The search warrant, armed with probable cause. Police obtained a search warrant on December 13th, 1978. The first official search of Gacy's home began. The officers entered the house, noting Gacy's nervous behavior. The first discovery, the search, wasn't easy. The house was cluttered. The crawl space was dark, cramped, and filled with debris. But soon, police found the first human remains. A skull, a hand bone. The officers froze, realizing the nightmare was real. Uncovering the crawl space, the discovery led to a painstaking excavation of the crawl space. Beneath the house, officers worked carefully, layer by layer. What they found was beyond belief. Multiple bodies buried haphazardly, some wrapped in plastic, others tied with rope. The river search when the crawl space grew too full. Gacy had dumped bodies in the nearby Des Plaines River. Police expanded the search to the river, dragging the bottom for evidence. More remains surfaced. Evidence collection inside the house. Police found handcuffs and ropes, an assortment of masks and clown costumes, personal belongings of missing boys, watches, wallets, jewelry, all of it carefully cataloged as evidence. Interrogation and confession faced with mounting evidence. Gacy's arrogance began to crack. He was arrested and taken in for questioning. Under pressure, he confessed to killing 33 young men and boys. His chilling admissions detailed the methods, how he lured victims with promises of work or money, how he used handcuffs and chloroform to restrain them, how he buried them beneath his house or dumped them in the river. The community reaction news of Gacy's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Friends, neighbors, and families struggled to accept the truth. How could someone so normal be capable of such evil? Vigils were held for victims. The media descended on the quiet suburb. The aftermath investigators continued digging for weeks, determined to find every victim. Each discovery was both a victory and a tragedy. Families finally had answers, but at a heartbreaking cost. The legacy of the investigation, the Gacy case, became a landmark in criminal investigation. It highlighted the importance of following up on missing persons reports, using surveillance and forensic science effectively, listening to survivors and community concerns. The trial of John Wayne Gacy was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle, a horrifying window into the darkest corners of humanity, broadcast to a nation that couldn't believe what it was witnessing. For weeks, the eyes of America were fixed on a courtroom in Chicago, where a man known as the Killer Clown faced the consequences of his unspeakable crimes. The setting: Cook County Criminal Courts. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, families of victims, law enforcement officers, and curious onlookers all jostled for space. The walls seemed to close in as the weight of the evidence pressed down on everyone present. Gacy sat at the defendant's table, impeccably dressed, his face a mask of false calm. Opening statements. A battle begins. The prosecution wasted no time, led by Robert Egan and Terry Sullivan. They laid out a grim roadmap: the victims, the crawl space, the confessions, the handcuffs, and the chilling pattern of deception. Their words were sharp, precise, leaving no room for doubt. The defense: the multiple personality strategy Gacy's defense team took a different route. They argued he was insane, that his mind was fractured to multiple personalities, Jacks, each with a separate identity. One was a law-abiding citizen, another was the killer, they claimed. Gacy didn't know what he was doing. Witness testimonies, survivors, and families speak. One of the most powerful moments came when survivors took the stand. Jeffrey Rignall, who had escaped, described in chilling detail the assault he survived. His trembling voice echoed through the courtroom. He used handcuffs, chloroform. I thought I was going to die. Families of victims gave tearful testimony, painting pictures of the boys as sons, brothers, friends, not just victims. Their grief was palpable. Evidence. Presentation. The horror unfolds. The prosecution introduced photographs of the crawl space, the bodies, the rope, the handcuffs, and the tools Gacy used. Jurors saw the house where horror hid beneath normalcy. Experts explained forensic findings, bones identified, time frames established, every detail chipped away at any defense claims. Gacy's behavior, smirks, and sketches. Gacy's conduct throughout the trial was unsettling at times. He doodled sketches of himself as Pogo, the clown. He smirked when victims were described. He closed his eyes during grim testimony, sometimes even napping. His chilling detachment angered many in the courtroom. Cross-examinations. Breaking the illusion, the prosecution grilled witnesses from the defense, exposing inconsistencies. Psychiatrists called by the defense couldn't conclusively prove Gacy was insane. One said, "He is a psychopath, but not insane. He understood right from wrong." This undermined the defense's argument. The jury's deliberation. After weeks of testimony, the case was in the jury's hands. They deliberated for only 2 hours. Their verdict was clear: guilty on all counts. On March 13th, 1980, the jury found John Wayne Gacy guilty of 33 counts of murder. The courtroom erupted with emotion. Some cried, others sat in stunned silence. The judge sentenced Gacy to death by lethal injection. The aftermath. Justice served. While the verdict brought some relief, it also opened wounds. Families felt a bitter mix of closure and sorrow. Questions lingered about the lives lost and the years of fear. Gacy's smirk faded. Taze remained. The courtroom drama had ended. The verdict was clear. John Wayne Gacy was sentenced to death, but the story didn't stop there. For the next 14 years, Gacy would live behind bars, waiting for justice to catch up. Life on death row. Gacy was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois, where he spent his days on death row. For some, prison is a time of reflection. For others, a time of broken hope. For Gacy, it was a stage. He continued to wear his mask, just differently. He wrote letters, gave interviews, and painted pictures, many of himself as Pogo the Clown. The oil paintings. Gacy's paintings were surreal and disturbing. Some depicted clowns dancing. Others showed somber faces. A few paintings were sold for hundreds of dollars, sought by collectors, fascinated by the macabre. His artwork was controversial, a symbol of how he tried to control the narrative, even from behind bars. Interviews and public statements. Over the years, Gacy granted numerous interviews in many. He maintained his innocence or minimized his guilt. He claimed he was misunderstood. In one chilling quote, he said, "I should never have been convicted of anything more serious than running a cemetery without a license." His arrogance was unbroken. The appeals process following his conviction. Gacy's legal team launched dozens of appeals. They challenged evidence, argued legal technicalities, and fought for clemency. Each appeal was denied. The courts reaffirmed the verdict and sentence. Justice, it seemed, was inevitable. The execution date, May 10, 1994, after years of waiting. John Wayne Gacy's execution was scheduled. The world watched. Families of victims gathered outside the prison, some praying, others in silent mourning. Final moments. Gacy's last meal was traditional: fried chicken, fried shrimp, French fries, strawberries, a Diet Coke. He ate quietly before being led to the death chamber. He reportedly painted one last picture of Pogo. Last words, he lay on the gurney. The chemicals began to flow. His final words were cold, defiant. "Kiss my ass." At 1:14 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead. The aftermath, healing and memory. His death brought some closure to families, but also reopened wounds. The community struggled to heal from this nightmare. Memorials were established to honor the victims. The house demolished. House on Summerdale Avenue, the site of so much horror, was torn down. The vacant lot replaced it. Some say the earth still holds the weight of the past, the legacy of John Wayne Gacy. Gacy's name remains synonymous with evil. His case is studied by law enforcement, psychologists, and criminologists. It serves as a grim reminder of how evil can hide behind a mask, of the importance of vigilance, of the lives lost to a man who preyed on innocence. Remembering the victims today. Efforts continue to identify unknown victims. DNA advances have helped solve some mysteries. Families share stories, keeping memories alive, because in the end, they are the true legacy.